You were not struggling because something went wrong with you. You were not burned out because you are weak or ungrateful or failing to manage your time correctly. You were not emotionally distant because you lack the capacity for connection. You are not running on empty because you made bad choices. The exhaustion you carry right now, that specific, layered, wordless kind of tired that sleep does not fix, is not a personal failure. It is a structural outcome. It was built into you with precision over decades by systems that had no interest in your interior life, only your output and your silence. You have been functioning. You have been delivering. You have been showing up for everything and everyone. And somewhere inside that relentless performance of capability, something critical stopped being maintained. Not broken, not collapsed, just quietly, steadily running on fumes in a way that looks from the outside like competence and feels on the inside like disappearing. The name for what you are carrying is not weakness. The name for it is accumulated suppression, and it did not arrive overnight. That state did not generate itself from nothing. It has a specific origin, a specific timeline, and a specific logic, and understanding that logic is the only honest starting point. Generation X contains roughly 65 million people in the United States alone, born between 1965 and 1980. And the men inside that cohort entered childhood during one of the most destabilizing cultural periods in modern Western history. The divorce rate in the United States doubled between 1960 and 1980, peaking at a point where nearly half of all marriages ended in separation. The economic disruptions of the 1970s, stagflation, oil shocks, the hollowing out of the industrial middle class, arrived during the formative years of this generation's childhood. And what those boys watched their fathers do in response to that instability was not process it. What they watched was suppression performed as strength. They watched men go silent and keep working. They watched stoicism treated as the only legitimate masculine response to a world that was falling apart in real time. That was the template. That was the inheritance. Not a philosophy, not a conscious choice, a survival behavior absorbed without language, installed through observation before any of the cognitive architecture existed to examine it. By the time those boys were teenagers, the cultural messages coming at them through film, music, television, and the adults in their lives were unified on a single point. Needing things is dangerous. Showing need is failure, and the correct response to pain is forward motion. The latchkey generation, the generation raised on the assumption that independence was the goal and self-sufficiency was the measure of character. Nobody said you are not allowed to have an interior life. Nobody had to. The architecture was already in place before the conversation could happen. And the heikwa, the psychological consequence, was not visible in the moment. It was slow. It was cumulative. It was a way of relating to the self that became so automated it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like identity. For Gen X men, the line between who you are and what you can tolerate without flinching was blurred so early that most of you have never experienced it as a line at all. That process did not produce a single clean psychological state. It produced a layered structure, several interlocking patterns operating simultaneously beneath the surface of the competence you project. And those layers need to be named separately because they function differently and they cost you differently. There are 5 layers inside this structure. The first is the one most visible in behavior, chronic functional override. The second is the one most tied to identity, the credibility of silence. The third is the one most tangled in relationships, emotional inaccessibility mistaken for stability. The fourth is the one most connected to meaning, the quiet erosion of internal reference points. The fifth one is almost never discussed, not in self-help, not in therapy circles, not in any mainstream framing of Gen X psychology, the grief of competence, the specific psychological cost of being reliably good at enduring things that should not have been endured alone. Each layer feeds the others. None of them exist in isolation. And the fifth one, the one at the bottom, is where the weight actually lives.
Layer 1. Chronic functional override. The most visible pattern is the one that gets the most positive feedback. You override. You feel something, discomfort, overwhelm, frustration, grief, physical exhaustion, and before that feeling reaches full articulation, something else engages. Something that has been running since childhood, a rapid automatic translation process that converts internal signal into task orientation. The feeling does not disappear. It is redirected. It becomes action, planning, problem solving, forward momentum. From the outside, this looks like resilience. It gets rewarded as resilience. It gets called leadership. It gets called dependability. What it actually is, at the mechanical level, is a suppression reflex so practiced it no longer requires conscious effort. The cost of this pattern is not dramatic. It does not look like a crisis. It looks like a man who is always fine, always functional, always able to handle one more thing until the day the handling becomes visibly effortful. And even then, the first response is to handle the visibility, not the underlying load. The accumulation is the problem, not any single override, but the 10,000 iterations of that same reflex compounding over 30 years of adulthood, producing a body and a nervous system that have been chronically under-resourced because every resource was immediately converted into output. You were not taught to replenish, you were taught to continue. Replenishment was not coded as a legitimate activity. It was coded as the reward you might receive after you finished everything, and everything never finished. This layer does not exist alone. It was made possible by the second layer, which was installed even earlier and runs even deeper. Layer 2. The credibility of silence. There is a specific and powerful belief inside Gen X male psychology that has almost never been examined out loud because the belief is itself a belief about the value of not speaking. The belief is this: silence under pressure is proof of character. Not just culturally acceptable, not just understandable, proof. Positive evidence of internal strength, reliability, and worth. A man who speaks about difficulty is performing difficulty. A man who does not speak is managing it. That equation was absorbed before you had language to examine it, and it became foundational to how you define credibility, including your own. This is not simple emotional repression. This is an epistemological commitment, a framework for what counts as evidence of being okay. And because it is a framework rather than just a behavior, it shapes perception in every direction. It shapes how you read other people. A person who expresses distress registers somewhere in the architecture as less reliable than a person who does not, regardless of what the rational mind believes about emotional health. It shapes how you read yourself. When you do experience something that wants to be expressed, the experience of wanting to express it triggers a second experience, a faint but persistent sense that this wanting is itself a problem, a signal of something slipping. And it shapes what you are willing to name internally, in private, with no audience, because even the internal audience operates by the same rules. You have been your own strictest enforcer of this standard. The silence was never just for other people, it was for you. The downstream effect of 2 decades of that practice inside relationships is where this becomes structural in a different way entirely. Layer 3. Emotional inaccessibility mistaken for stability. The people who depend on you, partners, children, colleagues, friends, have organized themselves around a version of you that is consistent, unshakable, and emotionally available in a particular direction, outward. You are available for their problems. You are available for logistics, decisions, crisis management, the practical architecture of shared life. What you are not consistently available for, and what some of the people closest to you have at various points in your life tried to find and eventually stopped looking for, is reciprocal emotional exposure.
Not because you do not have an interior life, not because you do not feel things, but because the mechanism for translating interior state into shared language was never developed to the same level as the mechanism for absorbing and managing other people's interior states. This asymmetry has a cost that compounds in both directions. The people around you experience a kind of relational ceiling, a sense that they can come to you, but that the passage does not go both ways. Some of them interpreted that ceiling as rejection. Some interpreted it as contentment, concluded that you simply do not need what they need, and adjusted their own expectations downward in ways neither of you ever named. And on your side, the asymmetry produces something specific, a loneliness that has no legitimate surface to land on, because the framework you operate inside does not recognize "I am lonely in my own relationships" as a coherent internal statement for a man who is clearly present, clearly contributing, clearly not abandoned. The loneliness is real. The framework has no category for it. So it does not become language. It becomes background pressure. It becomes the particular texture of showing up for decades to a version of connection that is never quite the connection that was needed. The three layers together, the override, the silence's credibility, the inaccessibility inside proximity, produce something that takes time to notice because it does not feel like a crisis. It feels like the absence of something you were never sure you were supposed to have. Layer 4, the quiet erosion of internal reference points. There is a specific type of disorientation that belongs almost exclusively to midlife Gen X men, and it is not the cliched midlife crisis, not the sudden desire for a sports car or a different life. It is quieter than that and more total. It is the experience of not knowing, when you are honest with yourself in a private moment, what you actually want. Not in terms of large life changes, in terms of ordinary days. What do you find genuinely satisfying, divorced from what you are supposed to find satisfying? What do you enjoy for its own sake with no productivity justification? What would you do with unstructured time if permission were not required? For many Gen X men, these questions produce a specific blankness. Not the blankness of someone who has never thought about it, but the blankness of someone who has been oriented outward for so long that the inward compass has lost calibration. This happened gradually. The override mechanism converted desire into action for so many iterations that desire stopped being a clear signal. It became noise before it could become information. The silence framework made interiority feel like something to manage rather than something to inhabit. The relational asymmetry meant that your own needs were consistently deprioritized, not with resentment necessarily, but with a quiet, practiced efficiency that left them chronically unaddressed. The result is a man who is highly competent at determining what others need and what situations require, and who has genuine difficulty determining what he himself needs at the level of experience rather than logistics. The internal reference points were not destroyed. They were buried under decades of outward orientation, and the burying was so smooth and so rewarded that it did not feel like loss until the losses were already substantial. These 4 layers combine into a single psychological structure, not 4 separate problems, but one integrated state with 4 visible faces. What you have been living inside is not a collection of habits to adjust or coping mechanisms to replace. It is a coherent psychological architecture built with real materials over a real timeline by real forces that predated your conscious participation. The functional override, the silence as credibility, the inaccessibility inside connection, the erosion of internal reference, these are not symptoms of a disorder. They are the logical outputs of a system that taught you with consistency and early authority that your interior life was a private liability to be managed, not a shared resource to be maintained. You learned this lesson perfectly. You have been executing it flawlessly for decades, and the cost of that flawless execution is sitting somewhere in your body right now, in the specific quality of the tiredness that does not have a name, in the gap between how capable you appear and how resourced you actually feel, in the moments of private blankness when the noise clears briefly and there is less underneath it than you expected. There is no comfortable place to land with that recognition. There is only the recognition itself and what belongs at the bottom of this structure, the fifth layer, the one that does not get discussed. Thank you for staying with this to the end. The fifth layer, what we are calling the grief of competence, the specific psychological weight of having been good at enduring things that should not have been carried alone, is a separate conversation, and it is the conversation that most directly connects to what it costs to begin doing things differently. That piece is linked below, and it picks up exactly where this one ends. If something in this landed in a way that felt accurate, not comfortable, but accurate, the like button is a way of marking that without having to explain it to anyone. Drop something in the comments about the layer that hit hardest, because that information matters for what gets made next. If you are watching this and you were born between 1965 and 1980, you did not get a manual for what was happening inside you. Subscribe, because that is what this channel is attempting to build, one piece at a time.